Now, we are now going to get into the final little bit while I've still got some visual capacity here, because my computer has been killing my visuals for whatever reason. We still have a moment, and we can look at this. So this is the summary of the nakshatra devatas, and this gives a picture of where all of the nakshatras fit. So there's many different groupings of the nakshatras. There's the adityas, there's the rudras, and the vasus. And really that's kind of the best depiction. There's these three spaces represent bhu, bhuva, and svaha. Atmosphere, sky, atmosphere, and earth. The adityas are celestial beings. The rudras are sort of more rajasic. Brahma, agitated from the failure of his sons to procreate, births Rudra from his angry brow. In turn, Rudra divides his body into a female and male half, and then further divides each half into 11 parts, which become the 11 Rudras and Rudranis. These Rudras protect the gods by abolishing the Asuras, and they are very important in all the Vedic literature, including the Mahabharata. So these guys are kind of not necessarily elemental like the Vasus are. They're more of like this rajasic reality, so far as I understand it. So we can see here that Rudra is the father of all of the other Rudras. And we can see Purva Bhadrapada, Uttara Bhadrapada, Mula, and Ashlesha all resonate with these Rudras. It's interesting that even Ashlesha itself is considered a Nagal energy. That is one of the Rudras. So, that is the nature of where Rudra fits in the divine celestial pantheon. It is not one of the Aditis. It's not one of the eternal timekeepers. Rudra is more of this intermediary. The celestial is above, and then the elements of earth are below. That's the Vasus, which relate to wind, fire, water, and all those forces. The Aditis are above as Bhu, I believe it would be. Actually, that would be Swaha. And then Bhu is the earth, the elements, water, fire, earth, etc. Bhuva is in the middle, and it's the intermediary plane where the divine on top can express itself through the earth via the intermediaries of the Rudras, the protectors of the intentions of the gods. So, it is in this book that we are going to find and start moving through our discussion on what Rudra is and what Rudra means in the Vedic literature. Rudra itself, this might be a long one because Rudra begins the discussion of all of the rest of the Rudras. So, that is our next section. Now we are getting into the deeper mythos of what Ardra Nakshatra's deity, Rudra, i.e. Shiva, how it's conveyed in the Vedas, and what that symbolism and mythology given in the Vedas means to the character of one who has an emphasis of this nakshatra. Now, this comes from a great book. It's called The Divine Forces of the Lunar Nakshatras, as portrayed in the Vedas. This comes by an author named Radhe. This author has done great, meticulous research into that given in the Vedas. all of the characters of the deities that are in the Vedas. And of course, this is the divine forces of the lunar nakshatras. So this is catering the depiction of these gods to what is given through the nakshatras. Now Rudra begins its own big whole section. This is section 4. It's Rudra and the Rudras in the Vedas. It's a whole new section of the book. Presented in this section are the 5 Rudra-ruled nakshatras. It's Ardra, Purva Bhadrapada, Uttara Bhadrapada, Mula, and Ashlesha. Of course, we're not going to read these until we get to those nakshatras, but this chapter begins this section of the book. Now, again, for everybody watching, this is the part of our podcast that is a little bit less methodical, and it's more just fun podcast moving through literature. At the very end, we're going to describe the nakshatra, the Ardra Native, and that will be included as the whole big picture of this video. But this bit is a relaxing, fun literary time. So get cozy, feel free to relax, and if you are here with us and you are interested in the Vedic literature, you are in the right place. So, this is chapter 17. This is enigmatic Rudra, Ardra, and his howling sons. The first thing we read is a little quote, and this is from the Rig Veda. This is Mandala 1. So this is one of the first, earliest bits of literature ever. I always love hearing things from the Rig Veda. But it's just a tiny little quote. Let's read what it says. What shall we sing to Rudra, strong, most bounteous, excellently wise, that shall be dearest to his heart? To Rudra, Lord of sacrifice, of hymns and balmy medicines, we pray for joy and health and strength. Very cool. So, chapter 1, we read that Rudra was abandoned at birth. We note that in chapter 5, on the chapter on Prajapati, which is the nakshatra Rohini. If you want to read about the real roots of the whole nakshatra pantheon, you want to read about Rohini and my video on it, because that Rohini and Prajapati, because that is the creation story. So that whole story is the foundation for this section on Rudra's birth. So, descriptions of the origin or birth of a devata are of immense value because they expound the intrinsic nature and fundamental qualities of the god. With only 4 shuktas dedicated to Rudra, the Rig Veda remains pretty silent on the matter of Shiva's birth. And so do the Yajur Veda and Atharva Veda. It's not until the Brahmanas were written that the origins and roots of Shiva and Rudra are revealed, although accounts of this event are pretty diverse. Now, we did read at the beginning this quote from the Rig Veda. So Shiva does exist in the Rig Veda, but there's really just the oblations there, and these oblations are considered to be very important and very ancient. So the Rig Veda, Mandala 1, chapter 43, as well as 114. We also read from Mandala 2, it's chapter 33, or verse 33, and then Mandala 7, chapter or verse 46. This book is not concise, so far as I can see, on chapters versus verses. But in any case, there are 4 hymns in the Rig Veda, collectively known as the Rudrasyas, and these are recited during various sacrificial ceremonies in honor of Rudra, and they're considered important to those ceremonial activities. Hello, Zuleika. Nice to see you. So, a lot of this stuff, when we read the literature, we find that the literature is contained as a living part of various Vedic ceremonies. I don't know if we're going to get into any of them here, but it's a big part of this whole book is describing the Vedic sacrifice ceremonies and rituals, because the literature of the gods are contained in those things. Now, relying on Rig Veda, chapter 10, verse 61, the Aitareya Brahmana, remember the Brahmanas are commentaries written by Brahmins on the literature given in the Vedas. You know, it might be useful for us to just have a quick little understanding here. The Vedas, like the Taittiriya Brahmana Sutra, the Vedas are enigmatic. They give us these little hints and these encoded descriptions of sutras, like the Rig Veda. When you read it, it's ancient stuff. And it would take a lot to try and unpack what is given in each of the encoded words and phrases of the Veda. The Vedas were written, there's the Rig Veda, and then there's the Atharva Veda, and then there's the Krishna Yajur Veda, and the Vedas themselves were written with these encoded things. Afterwards, they were written by the original rishis who had the clairvoyance to understand what those codings really meant. Now, later down the line, the followers of the Vedas, those who were interested in the Vedic literature, wanted to unfurl it further. And so this is when the Brahmanas were created, including what we're reading here. There's a Brahmana called the Aitareya Brahmana, and the Aitareya Brahmana is a commentary on this section. It's commentating on these Rig Veda verses talking about Rudra. So relying on Rig Veda, chapter 10, verse 61, the Aitareya Brahmana begins its story of creation with the reiteration of Prajapati's desire for his daughter, Usas, which is dawn. It's a beautiful metaphor there of Brahma, the creator, always wanting to chase the dawn, the initiation of creation. Embellishing upon Brahma's lustful attraction, this Brahmana, this commentary, unfolds the legend fully. Here it is recounted how the gods, horrified at having witnessed Prajapati's lust for his own daughter, give birth to Rudra from their united fury, and they instruct Rudra to kill Prajapati with his arrow, with Shiva's arrow. This lore reveals the extreme conditions surrounding Rudra's origin and divulges many of his character traits, of what Shiva is, of what Rudra and Shiva's intentions are. Firstly, Rudra is birthed from the collective rage of the gods, rage that arises from the horror of having witnessed an act never before committed. Thus, instilled at birth with the wrath of the gods, Rudra has anger running through his blood. Secondly, Rudra is ordered by the Vishvadevas to execute a divine being, one of their own, no less. This is an act likewise never before committed at this point in creation. Born for the express purpose of killing Prajapati, Rudra's dharma is seemingly to disrupt the creative force of the universe. Thank you, Julia. Glad to have you here. Thank you for your well wishes for my stable internet connection. So, thirdly, as Rudra is clearly a cosmic afterthought, all of the really important divine duties of the universe are already divvied up amongst the gods by the time of Rudra's birth. Hence, Rudra is considered a one-act show. This is so common of Shiva. This is why Shiva is the character that he is. He abides by nobody. He has no authority other than his own. He's a one-act show. This is part of the reason why he can be depicted as being such a troublemaker in a way, can be so against the grain of society. Just like those Shivites who hang out at the ghats in the crematoriums and put ashes on their head and hang out with human skulls and watch the deterioration of the material body because they seek to go beyond it, which is freaky for a lot of us humans. It's like, oh. Now, as if 3 strikes weren't sufficient, it soon becomes evident that Rudra's birth is a mere impulse on the part of the gods. No sooner had Rudra pierced Prajapati than the gods become deeply remorseful, even embarrassed, about their rash deed. They're like, whoa, things have got really heated here. They now realize that Prajapati's seduction of his daughter is a grand yajna performed for the purpose of creation. You got to dig that Prajapati, as I always say, in the original Vedic literature, in the deep core parts of the Vedic literature, before the Brahmanas were written, Prajapati was creation, making love with creation to create creation. That's Prajapati chasing its own daughter, because if Prajapati is the creator, then anything created of the creator is creation, and the creator wants to inseminate creation with creation. So this is why Prajapati raping his own daughter is, in the very farthest literature, considered, as we've just read, it's a grand yajna performed for the purpose of creation. It's later on that they realize that this is a father raping its own daughter, and they imply the moral ethical epithet to that. But throughout the whole thing, this is like the human dimension of Vedic literature having a conversation with the divine dimension of human nature, of Vedic literature. So it's just an interesting conversation going on there. But this is how it happens. They realize that at the human level, that this is an unethical thing, that Prajapati's raping his own daughter. So they send Shiva to kill Prajapati. Then once Shiva sends the arrow through Prajapati, they realize that there was something mystical going on there in terms of necessary dimensions of creation, and then they feel bad about it. So in order to rectify their wrong, the Vishvadevas make an offering of Prajapati's injured part, the prasitra, the part that Shiva hit with the arrow. However, they ignore the very god who is responsible for creating the offering, which is Rudra himself. They even refuse Shiva a seat at the sacrifice. Now, from that day forward, again, this is all coming from the Aittiriya Brahmana, this one version of the story. So when they neglect to bring Shiva to this great sacrifice of Prajapati's limb, because Shiva's the one who did that, this mercenary guy, they didn't bring him to their rectification of what they called on him to be a mercenary for. So he didn't get to be a part of that. He was aware he didn't get to be a part of it. So from that day forward, the Vishva Devas wash their hands of Rudra's birth and his atrocious deed. Never again is Rudra accepted as a child of the gods, nor is he included in their sacrificial club. We have a footnote here that reminds us that Rudra is rarely summoned to the yajnas, to the Vedic sacrifice ceremony. On the contrary, he is beseeched to stay away from the sacrificial grounds. However, several important ceremonies were instituted by the Brahmin caste for Rudra's appeasement, including the Shatarudriya. So there are certain ceremonies that do appease this nature of Shiva. It's interesting. Old drama, very old drama, the oldest that there is inside of ourselves. I often talk about how Shiva is ultimate reality. And if we all were sitting in the ultimate reality right now, human life could hardly exist as it does. That's why Vishnu is considered the primary, well, Shiva and Vishnu go between each other as the primary god of Vedic literature. Vishnu holds and sustains the reality of things at the heart, and Shiva cuts through it all to be united with the one divine. These two are always intermingling with and through each other, Vishnu and Shiva. And this is part of the reason why Shiva, as ultimate reality, is a hard thing for anybody to channel. You can only do it so much, but at some point you've got to regenerate yourself through Vishnu, through material reality, through abundance, through love, through emotions, through the people around you. You regenerate yourself through Vishnu, and then through Vishnu, you develop ghee, which is energy that you ultimately surrender back to Shiva. This is the back and forth of moving towards sattvic divinity. Now, there is another, I should say before we go on that this radical orphanage by the Vishvadevas has a profound effect on Shiva and Rudra's character and self-image as this dark loner. It's this individual person who's an outcast, stays away from everybody and everything in order to be in the transcendental. So, now the Shatapatha Brahmana. Thank you, everybody, for everybody's mentioning. I appreciate you all understanding the technical issues. Teresa mentioned you want to timestamp that, what I said, but you can't see the time. I'm sure that the time is going to be a tricky thing to see because of all the technical issues that we've had. So I do thank you all for understanding all of that. So that was the Aittiriya Brahmana's description of Rudra's character. Now there's another one called the Shatapatha Brahmana, and this offers another version of Rudra's birth. And this one is based on Rig Vedic cosmogony in the Rig Vedic hymn chapter 10, verse 121. This hymn tells of Prajalpati's birth from a golden cosmic egg, Hiranyagarbha, and the subsequent emission of all living creatures from his body, from Prajalpati's body. The lore calls attention to the toll that this magnificent feat has on the creator. Prajalpati produced creatures, and this is a quote. Prajalpati produced creatures. Having produced creatures and run the whole race, completed creation from start to finish, he became relaxed and expended. From him, when relaxed, the vital air went out from within. Then his vigor went out of him. That having gone out, he fell down. This is the Shatabrata Brahmana telling this story. Now, beholding Prajalpati in such an extreme condition of expendedness, the gods are frightened and immediately exit the scene, except one god who remains faithfully by his side. That god is Manu, which means grief or wrath, and he grows larger with each passing moment. Angry at the Vishvadevas for deserting Prajalpati in his time of need, and fearful of being face to face with Manu, his own mortality, Prajalpati cries uncontrollably. His first teardrop lands on that dreadful being, Manu. It transforms Manu into a 100-headed, 1,000-eyed, 100-quivered Rudra. With each subsequent teardrop, innumerable other Rudras appear. And the other teardrops, and this is a quote, the other teardrops that fell down spread over these worlds in countless numbers by thousands. And inasmuch as they originated from crying, Rud, those beings were called Rudras, roarers or criers. It comes from Shatapatha Brahmana as well. Now, confronted by such horrific creatures, Prajalpati is certain of his demise. Meanwhile, full of regret for having abandoned Prajalpati, the Vishvadevas, these guys can't get their shit together sometimes, the Vishvadevas return to the scene, only to find Rudra with his bow strung and his arrow fitted to the string, who was inspiring fear for being in quest of food. Terrified for their own sweet lives, the Vishvadevas plea for Prajalpati to appease this ghastly god, Rudra, that has been created. To appease Prajalpati, and also wanting to pacify Rudra. So, Prajalpati instructs the Vishvadevas to satisfy Rudra's hunger with oblations, with sacrifice mantras with gestures towards the divine. The gods make Ashanti, a peace offering, consisting of 425 sacred oblations. This sacrificial protocol is the famous Shaturidriya, belonging to or sacred to 100 Rudras. It's interesting, at some level this shows us that much of the anger, the compulsions, the desire for things, for sex, for power, these are things inborn inside the human character that may appear at one level to be real, but really they are just a potential for energy. It's just pure energy that could be sublimated into diviner things, into, in this case, sacrificial oblations to the divinest gods, so that those angers and those untended potential realities of the Rudras inside of us all could be put to some kind of divine use. Now, believed to be efficacious against illness, disease, and sin, this famous Chaturudriya eulogizes Rudra in all his glories and sacred manifestations. Without a doubt, this is the most significant hymn codified in the Vedic literature. I didn't know that. That's pretty sweet. Chaturudriya. Chaturudriya. Very interesting. Now, lastly, there is another important Shatapatha Brahmana legend of Rudra's birth. In this legend, Prajapati parents a baby boy, Kumara. At birth, the boy yells out to his father, "My evil has not been taken away, and a name has not been given to me. Give me a name." Kumara is the age of youth, so that's not the actual name of this boy. So the boy cries out and says, "Give me a name." Prajapati grants Rudra a name, but with each name given, his son insists on an even grander one. When all is said and done, Rudra is assigned 8 names in addition to Kumara. It's Rudra, Sarva, which means manifold, Pashupati, the lord of beasts, Ugra, which means fierce, Asani, which means thunderbolt, Bhava, which means existence, Mahadeva, which is the great deity, and Ishana, which is ruler or master. Rudra's multifarious nature is a common theme of both legends, having this multifarious, many-sided nature. We have a footnote that says, in the Shiva Purana, Rudra's 8 appellations become Shiva's Astamurtis, or 8 forms, with the exception that Bhima, dreadful, is substituted for Ashani. That comes from the Shiva Purana. Now, although silent on the matter of his birth, the Rig Veda touts Rudra's hallmark feature. So the Rig Veda doesn't talk about Rudra's birth, but it does tout the feature that everyone knows about Rudra, which is his ominous wail. Which is likened to the crackling of lightning and the clashing of thunder, which are both precursors to a raging storm. So, the next thing we read is the next chapter where Rudrasyas is exiled from the world. I'm going to read a little bit about what that's all about. From the very beginning, Rudra is shunned by the Vishvadevas, particularly Prajapati, who is Rudra's polar opposite. Deeply engaged in the senses, Prajapati immerses himself in the mundane world. So Prajapati is Rudra's polar opposite. Rudra goes out of the senses, whereas Prajapati, being deeply engaged in the senses, immerses himself in the mundane world. Now, Rudra being tainted by the stigma of wrathful impetuousness, Rudra turns away from all of this worldliness and the mundane civility of the regular world. Being unwelcomed by the people of the land and uninvited to the sacrificial yajnas of the elite Brahmin caste, Rudra retreats to the mountains. Occasionally he's spotted sitting atop stable dung heaps, dwelling inside isolated trees, meandering at crossroads, or roaming the burial grounds. Despite his expatriation, the village people have a constant fear that impetuous Rudra might one day pay a visit. When such an ill-fated event comes to pass, families beseech Rudra to disappear just as quickly as he appeared, praying that no carcasses are left in his wake. May the weapon of Rudra avoid us. May the great anger of the flaring one pass us by. Unstring they strong bows for the sake of our liberal lords, O bounteous Rudra. Be gracious to our kith and kin. That comes from the Rig Veda. It's Mandala 2, chapter 3, verse 14. Indeed, ever since the sacrificial prashitra crafted by Rudra causes Bhaga to lose his eyes, Pushan to lose his teeth, and Savitri to lose his hands. Even the gods tremble at the thought of Rudra's presence. Now this reference to Bhaga losing his eyes, Pushan losing his teeth, and Savitri losing his hands, this all has to do with the creation myth of Prajapati and what happens when Shiva has to kill Prajapati. You can read about it all in the Rohini series, or the Rohini episode. So gods and men alike equate Rudra to all things dreadful, unrefined, volatile, and dangerous in life. We have a footnote that says it's important to note that Rudra's fierce nature becomes greatly embellished in the legends of the Brahmana texts. This is reflected in Ardra's Taittiriya Brahmana invitation in oblation verses as follows. So this comes from the Taittiriya Brahmana, which is, of course, the text which we've used to define the nature of the nakshatras. Now, the Taittiriya Brahmana actually has more than the particular sutras that we've read. This is a little bit of extra information given in that Brahmana sutra. Along with, and this comes from Taittiriya Brahmana, along with Ardra, his nakshatra, Rudra, spreading himself, goes, sorry, the language is confusing here. Along with Ardra, his nakshatra, Rudra, spreading himself, goes, the best of the gods, the lord of cows. To his nakshatra, we would offer worship with oblation. May he not harm our offspring, may he not harm our men. Let the dart of Rudra pass us by. Let Ardra, the nakshatra of Rudra, enjoy our oblation. Shaking off all evils, let them both, Rudra and Ardra, drive away the wicked, which is the enemy. Now, Rudra has several attributes in common with Varuna, which is the deity of the nakshatra Shatabhishak, a devata likewise renowned for his ugra, his terrible or fierce demeanor. Rudra and Varuna are both identified with the dark, foreboding nighttime. Armed with death-inflicting weapons, Varuna's armament is 100 fettered noose, and Rudra's is an endless supply of sharply pointed arrows. These two are both wrathful gods of destruction. However, Varuna's wrath is predictable. It defies Vishnu's holy ordinances, and retribution is assured. In stark contrast is the impulsive wrath of Rudra, striking like a blast of lightning at the least suspected time. No two devatas are less welcome in the household, especially in light of their ability to inflict illness, disease, and death. Still, these two are revered by all. Grateful for their ability to heal the very illnesses they inflict, people shout their glories and offer sacrificial treats to these gods. It's not uncommon for a Rigvedic devata endowed with a particular faculty to also possess its opposite power. Hence, striding Vishnu retracts the three worlds from the asuras, as well as creates space, i.e. dimensions, or akasha, for the three realms to take form. Varuna binds the sinner with his 100 snares, as well as eradicates the wrongs committed by the repentant sinner. Rudra inflicts disease and illness upon others, and, as Vaidyanatha, the lord of all physicians, he also bestows health. It's like each of these figures is like an axis of the health represented. Vishnu is an axis. In order to create, it also must have the implication of limit. In order for Varuna to have the idea of the opposite of sin, there must be sin. In order for Rudra to be the bestower of wealth and health, he must simultaneously give the possibility of non-health, not of disease. It's often how it is given in the Vedas. Now, here is where their commonality ends, and their more compelling differences surface. Firstly, despite his staunch reputation, Varuna is a well-entrenched member of the ruling divine establishment. An insider with many divine companions. He's in the in-crowd. Varuna, for all the destruction that he can cause, is one of the devatas. He's in that crowd. On the other hand, Rudra is associated with gambling halls and slaughtering houses. He's an outcast through and through, often found wandering along a desolate road or in a remote forest. Rudra, this devata, literally lives on the wild side of life. He has no divine playmates and never once pairs as a devatadvandva. He has no divine playmates and never once pairs as a devatadvandva. And that's a close-knit set of two devatas, which often happens with many of the devas. Even his own sons, the Rudras, or also known as the Maruts, prefer roaming the skies with Indra over staying at home with their father. Perhaps it is his paradoxical nature, containing all forms of opposites, as elaborated in the Shatarudriya, that allows Rudra to become content with his aloneness. Rudra containing all forms of opposites. Very interesting. Just making sure you guys can see me here. Furthermore, Varuna plays by a well-defined set of rules, i.e. Vishnu's Shravana holy decrees. So Varuna plays by Vishnu's rules, Vishnu being the deity of Shravana. So Shatabijak and Shravana have a close association there. Now Rudra abides only by his rules. Rudra is the human ego, and Vishnu is divine law and order, and Varuna is the arbiter of divine law and order. Shiva is the pure seed potential of pure awareness, pure consciousness. And ideally, when these two come together, this is when great divinity happens. They oftentimes are a square and trying to fit a square peg into a circular hole. But Shiva, the pure potentiality of the individualization of the ego, is there in order that Vishnu's divine law and order means something. I might just give my own take on what's happening there. So, ultimately, Rudra is not like Varuna. Rudra, they're like each other because they cause destruction and all these sorts of things. But while Varuna plays by the well-defined set of rules given by Vishnu, Rudra abides only by his rules. Even on his worst day, Varuna rarely threatens the life of a woman, child, or animal. Rudra, however, is endlessly beseeched for fear of just such an occasion. In the Vedas, placation is given to Rudra so that such a thing doesn't happen. And this quote comes from Shatapatha Brahmana. Neither to our children and our children's children, nor to our life, neither to our kine, nor to our horses, please do thou injury, Rudra. Comes from Shatapatha Brahmana. Now, lastly, their sacrificial functions are also worlds apart. Symbolically represented by the Maitra Varuna priest, Varuna is the formidable commander of the yajna. Okay, I see. So again, the sacrifices, the Vedic yajna, the sacrifice ritual, contains in a strong way the essence, the root essence of what the nakshatras mean, and even the nakshatras resonate to the tone of the yajna, the great Vedic yajna ceremony. And in the sacrifice in the yajna, their functions are worlds apart. So Varuna, represented by the Maitra Varuna priest. Varuna is the commander of the Vedic yajna sacrifice ceremony. Rudra not only lacks a role in the Brahmanic yajnas, but as slayer of Makha, the sacrifice, is not even offered a place alongside the other gods seated around the sacrificial fire. It is only because it is inauspicious to ignore any devata when it comes to doling out oblations that Rudra is allotted the sacrificial remnants or leftovers, as well as paps made of uncultivated and uncooked grains, not exactly the most mouth-watering offerings. Like Varuna, Indra, who rules the Jyeshta Nakshatra, Indra is another devata whose characteristics are both similar and dissimilar to Rudra's. For example, Indra and Rudra are described as ghora, a term traditionally translated as terrible or horrible. Importantly, Ganda notes that ghora is a more complex expression incorporating that mingling of respect, fear, and startled wonder, which is denoted by the English word awful. Awe and amazement, and in extreme cases, fear. Ghora, G-H-O-R-A. So that's a little quote that comes from a book called The Vision of the Vedic Poets. I almost want to check that out myself. So both Rudra and Varuna are held in awe by devotees as they perform their ghastly duties. Both ride the tempestuous waves of the atmosphere, bhuva, and both are closely associated with the Maruts. Rudra is their father, and Indra their leader. So we're actually talking about Indra right now. I'm sorry. Glad I clarified that. It's Indra who rides the bhuva, the atmosphere, the sky. Rudra is the father of the Maruts, and Indra is the leader of the Maruts. Both possessing abnormal physical strength, they are depicted as manly bulls of the sky. Rudra is the fierce, impetuous, and wild side of the bull, and Indra is its strong, powerful, and generative aspects. Rudra's Rigvedic likeness to a bull perhaps explains Nandi, the bull, as Shiva's Puranic Vahana, which is his vehicle. Interesting. Very interesting. It's not commonly given as to why Shiva has this bull. It's riding on a bull. And this book is saying that Rig Veda describes Shiva as having a bull-like strength, and that's where that comes from. With their much admired stout limbs and golden arms, these two devatas, Indra and Rudra, are renowned for hurtling sharp weapons capable of mass destruction. Indra hurtles the Vajra, the thunderbolt, and Rudra releases 100 arrows and missiles. Both bestow dauntless boons onto those who eulogize them. Rudra imparts pure bravery and courage, and Indra confers dominance. Now, on the other hand, unlike Soma-dependent Indra, Rudra is rarely invited to partake of the divine nectar. Garbed in the skin of an antelope, he is uniquely the hunter amongst the gods. In contrast, with his buff body draped in a tiger skin, Indra reigns supreme as monarch of the gods. Both are deemed brave, yet Rudra is never seen at the battles between the gods and Asuras. Indeed, even his own sons, the Maruts, leave him behind as they dart off to join Indra in combat. Indra has the Vishvadevas as cheerleaders, inciting Indra to ever greater heroic measures. Similar enthusiasm is lacking for Rudra. Although Indra is more than just a bit enamored with himself, he remains a social and cooperative god. Rudra can't manage to cooperate with even the most congenial of devatas. Despite his untamed, reckless, and wild demeanor, Rudra's paradoxical nature affords the possibility of blessings for those who praise him. This is thy sacrificial share, O Rudra, for which thou didst ask. Rejoice in it. Find for us the lordship of cows, abundance of wealth, with good heroes, and a year's prosperity. That little bit comes from the Taittiriya Samhita. This brings us to Rudra's unusual relationship with animals, particularly cattle. Rudra is the god most frequently implored not to inflict cattle with illness or disease or death. He's even offered a special pap made of gaveduka, a species of wild corn, to prevent Rudra from hankering for the cows in the slaughterhouse. We note there's a footnote that says in the Taittiriya Brahmana, Rudra's sacrificial wish is for the wealth in cattle. Rudra desired, "May I be rich in cattle." He offered in milk that well-known sacrificial pap prepared from priyamgu, which is panic grass, to Rudra, meaning to himself, and to his own nakshatra, Ardra, in the sky. Consequently, he became rich in cattle. He indeed becomes rich in cattle who offers that oblation and who thus knows it. So on this occasion, after the chief oblation, the sacrificer offers the additional oblations, saying, to Rudra, Svaha, to Ardra, Svaha, to the swelling one, Svaha, to cattle, Svaha. It's just more information about how Rudra was considered as a god that could be given certain oblations as relating to cattle. Now, perhaps all this stuff about cattle is rooted in the legendary piercing of Prajapati, an act which safeguards Prajapati's daughter, who had transformed into a doe, and earns Rudra the title of Pashupati, which is the lord of animals. Now, in something called the Shulagava, which is the cow or oxen ceremony, a calf, which is the best of the herd, is sacrificed to Rudra in order to avert the loss of cattle in the coming year. Performed under Ardra Nakshatra, the ceremony contains many sacrificial peculiarities that reflect Rudra's eccentricity. It's to be performed after midnight, which is Rudra's time of day, at a place on the northern outskirts of the village. No one except the officiants are to attend, for fear Rudra will do harm to others. The calf is tied to a sacrificial yupa, a post or stake made of a nearby branch. This is in contrast to the very finely crafted sacrificial yupa erected on the eastern end of the sacrificial grounds. Interesting. So it says it's an ad hoc sacrificial yupa. It's just kind of thrown together. Once sacrificed, the blood of the calf is drained and served as an oblation to the serpents of the north, which is Rudra's sacrificial direction. While the omentum is removed and offered to the fire as the officiants repeat Rudra's 12 sacred names: Hara, Mrida, Sarva, Shiva, Bhava, Mahadeva, Ugra, Bhima, Pashupati, Rudra, Sankara, and Ishana. When this ceremony is complete, the officiants return to the village, absent anything belonging to the sacrifice and without looking back. For Rudra will surely harm them and the villagers should they do otherwise. According to scripture, in addition to safeguarding cattle, the Shulagava procures wealth, long life, and splendor. It's just interesting how they deal with this one particular sacrifice ceremony involving Rudra. It's this necessary darkness that they got to get through, you know. Now finally, as Tigmeshu, one with sharp arrows. Rudra is honored as an expert marksman, legendary for his strong bow and quick arrows. The author Bloomfield describes him as the typical archer of the Veda, whose missile is dreaded in every book of literature. Should the gods require an expert marksman, suddenly Rudra is their best friend. Hence this famous arrow-bearing archer, whose bow is strong and sure, and his arrow, that comes from the Rig Veda. His arrow has bahu, which is the limb of a bow, for his ancient nakshatra appellation. Interesting. And that comes from the Taittiriya Brahmana. So this bahu, which is the strong arms, as we've read, this seems to be considering that to be a bow. Now, noted by Bhadrapadas, Bahu, with the root of bah, also means to try or to make an effort. So Bahu's foundation from above is hunters or gods of piercing qualities, and the foundation below is a lucky or fortunate hit. Its Shakti is the harmful force or effort of piercing. And of course, if you guys are paying attention, that's what we've just read about in the depiction of the Taittiriya Brahmana from Ernst and Vick. This is the author Radhe giving her interpolation of that sutra. It's hunters from above, or gods of piercing qualities, and the foundation below is a lucky or fortunate hit. Interesting. Now, Rudra becomes a murti of Shiva during the later Puranic era, retaining much of his Vedic iconography, such as the kaparda, the knotted hair. And the kaparda is a braided hair knot in the form of a pointed cowrie shell. Fashioning his hair in such a manner, Rudra is given the epithet kapardin, weaver of the kaparda. That comes from the Rig Veda, as well as that famous oblation to him. Can't find the name of what it was. The Shatarudriya. That's what we hear that from. In any case, Rudra becomes a murti of Shiva in the later Puranic era. And he is seen with his Vedic iconography, such as the kaparda, the knotted hair, his blue neck, nilankanta, his animal skin loincloth, and unique relationship with snakes. Rudra retires his sharp arrows for the pointed trident. This is in the Puranic literature. His sons, the Rudras, are replaced by a troop of ghastly beings, and Rudra takes the appellation Bhutapati, Lord of Ghostly Beings. Rudra's 100-aspect nature expands to 1,008 auspicious attributes. Millions of devotees tout his divine features, and he gains status equal to that of Brahma and Vishnu. Despite acquiring a more auspicious persona, Rudra remains forever intent on destroying Daksha's yajna. Right, and so you can find more about that on the chapter on Rohini and Prajapati. Of the Hindu triad, Shiva is known as the destructive force in the universe. That's Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. This is Shiva's appellation as in the later Puranic literature, the New Testament I was talking about. So with his outcast nature, Rudra, as Shiva, is effortlessly transformed into the greatest of ascetics, retaining his love for mountaintops and the wilderness. However, unlike the character of Rudra, Shiva is also adept at being a householder should the need arise. Rudra did father the Rudras, but once born, they became constant companions to Indra. Hence, little is made of Rudra's householder position in the Rig Veda. Shiva will do his duty as a civil householder, which is interesting. Such is the case when Shiva marries Sati, and later Parvati. Shiva and Parvati even have two sons, Ganesha and Skanda. Skanda is conceived for the purpose of killing the mighty asura Taraka. This is a story that's given in the chapter on Agni, as well as, yeah, that's all given on the chapter on Agni. Now, strong and commanding is Skanda, and Skanda is also endearing and much more civil than the howling band of Vedic Maruts, which are the sons of Rudra. In both his Vedic and Puranic personifications, Rudra remains riddled with contradictions. He is truly the most enigmatic of the 33 divine forces of the lunar nakshatras. So Rudra is always this interesting particular character. Now, something we go through in this reading is we're going to talk about Rudra's pouch of herbs. This is the next chapter that we're going to be moving through. As Sahasrakshas, that's a tricky one. So being Sahasrakshas, being of 1,000 eyes, this is an epithet, Sahasrakshas, that implies a wide and vast vision. Other Rigvedic devatas possessing 1,000 eyes include Varuna, Agni, Indra, and Soma in different places and positions in the Vedas. So Rudra is one of the ones of 1,000 eyes. Thus, Rudra is praised for his all-seeing wisdom, particularly in the field of medicine. He is acclaimed as the first divine physician and receives the epithet Vaidyanatha, the Lord of all physicians. May I attain, O Rudra, to 100 winters through the most blissful medicines which thou hast given. Rise up, our men, by thy medicines, for I hear thou art the best of all physicians, Vaidyanatha. That is an oblation given to Rudra in the Rig Veda, Mandala 2, chapter 33, verses 2 and 4. So indeed, this extraordinary physician carries in his hands practically every curative remedy to be found in the forests or mountains. There seems to be a footnote here, but it's a confusing one. I don't know what to make of that. It's in letter A, and the rest of them are all numbers, so that's okay. But ultimately, Rudra, as this extraordinary physician, carries in his hands practically every curative remedy to be found in the forests or mountains. I'm glad to see our friend Reshma has been enjoying this series. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And for everybody else who's hanging out with me here. It's fun to talk about the Veda. I'm glad to be doing it. Now, for a Devata representing the harsh and uncultivated side of life, Rudra's miraculous healing faculties seem out of character. However, from a different perspective, his fascination with healing perfectly suits his reclusive lifestyle. As the turbaned mountaineer, which is given again in that same text that we mentioned, that being the, the Shatarudriya. I've got to remember that. We hear in the Shatarudriya that Rudra is called the turbaned mountaineer, as well as the jungle dweller. He's also called Vanapati, Lord of the Forest, and Vrikshapati, Lord of the Trees. This all comes from that same text. Rudra possesses a profound knowledge of the mystical powers of arcane plants and herbs. Thus, who is more likely amongst the divine forces than Rudra to have a pouch filled with every balm that heals? And that's a quote that comes from the Rig Veda, Mandala 5, chapter 42, verse 11. Rudra has a pouch filled with every balm that heals. There are countless indications that Vedic Rudra is also expert in magic and sorcery. For example, one who practices witchcraft is said to make an oblation to Rudra. Rudra's colors are red and blue, the colors of magic. That comes from the Atharva Veda. That fact. Now, in the famous Shaturudriya hymn, again, Rudra is beseeched to turn thou aside all practices of witchcraft. Interesting. Now, lastly, two of his most beloved haunts, which is the crossroads and inside of an isolated tree. These are known as venues for the performance of magic. Very interesting. God, these hairs on my face are just itching my nose like crazy. Rudra cures with many rare and mystical herbs, but his most potent remedy is a very simple one, jalasa. Where, O Rudra, is your merciful hand which heals and has the jalasa for a remedy? That quote comes from the Rig Veda. Considering varied scriptural passages and possible Sanskrit translations, the author Bloomfield makes the case that jalasa is intended as Rudra's urine, while acknowledging that mutra is the more traditional Sanskrit term. I don't know what has got my nose itching like crazy right now, but it's very inconvenient. We have a footnote that reads that others have argued that jalasa refers simply to water. Given Rudra's access to mountain streams and rivers, such a translation is equally plausible. Now, the therapeutic use of urine is a common Ayurvedic practice. Its efficacy is based on the fact that a person's urine contains an immense array of nutrients, enzymes, and natural antibodies. For a devata who subsists solely on wild plants and herbs, surely Rudra's urine is as potent as it comes. Rock and roll. Gotta love the Vedas. That's wild in my understanding, but I'm not Rudra, so that's probably why I have that reaction to it. I have heard such things about urine. It's interesting to see it applied to Vedic literature. Teresa's noting that it's important to look at the astronomy of the stars of the nakshatras. Vic Takara does place high value on it, and I'm interested in it as well. They don't talk about it much in this book series, but it's a good point to make, Teresa, and I thank you for mentioning it. Now, alternatively, given Rudra's special affiliation with dangerous substances, as we're going to see in the following section, it is likely that Rudra consumes plants and herbs of the poisonous variety. Thus, when treating any poisonous illness or disease with Rudra's urine, one is in effect applying the renowned homeopathic approach of treating like with like. I think Zuleika is making an important point here. We are reading about a divine character named Rudra, and the character of Rudra, as we've kind of mentioned, there's a homeopathic approach of treating like with like, and Rudra drinks the poison so that his urine might have this homeopathic reflection to one who has drank a poison. Rudra's urine might give it the opposite. Not only that, but in general, Rudra is a devata, so it might be symbolic that his urine might be giving something that is different from the typical human urine. Definitely a good point to bring up, Sailaka. I mean, rock and roll for people to research. If it's a thing in Ayurveda, then maybe there is some importance to it that is more of an Ayurvedic concern than our present concern. But I appreciate you making that point, Zulaika. Zulaika. So, although Rudra is clearly not a favorite amongst the Vishvadevas, he is respectfully tolerated because of his deeds during the ghastly Vritra battle, which is an important battle in the Vedic literature. According to a Shatapatha Brahmana legend, the demon Vritra and his army of Asuras strike the Vishvadevas down with their death-inflicting arrows. Facing their demise, the gods make oblations to Rudra while reciting his famous life-restoring mantra, the Trayambakam, pervading the three worlds, or three-eyed, is what that means. The mantra was divinely inspired by Rishi Vasishta and first appears in the Rig Veda. Om Trayambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushti Vardhanam Urvarukam Iva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshya Mamritat. Getting better at my Vedic pronunciation, just going with what I see here. That's Rig Veda, Mandala 7, chapter 59, verse 12. And what it means is, we sacrifice to Trayambakam, Rudra, the sweet-scented wealth increasing. May I be detached from death like a gourd from its stem, but not from the immortal. Wow, I've heard that before. That's where that comes from. That's a beautiful, very important phrase in Vedic literature. May I be detached from death like a gourd from its stem, but not from the immortal. Like a gourd that has been released into individuality, but let me still remain attached to the stem of immortality. With this reference to Rudra, the Vishvadevas remove the poisonous arrows one by one and live to see another day. Interesting. The Trayambakam is famous to this day for releasing one's descendants from disease and sins. It also releases the blemishes of those yet to be born. The prescribed Brahmana rite is to recite the Trayambakam while making an offering to Rudra on behalf of each descendant, plus one additional oblation for all those yet to be born. Cakes are offered while facing north, which is Rudra's sacrificial direction, and preferably at crossroads, Rudra's favorite haunt. It's very interesting. I'm just thinking of if anybody knows the blues legend of the crossroads. I went down to the crossroads, fell down on my knees, bow, 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 diddle, diddle, down. The crossroads is this interesting crossroads place, and Rudra haunts there. It's very interesting that it's possible that these crossroads just have a mythos associated with Rudra. And the blues writings on the crossroads, if you look up the song called The Crossroads, it's an old blues writer. It was one of the very first blues songs written. And that whole song is about talking with the devil at this crossroads. And maybe the character of the devil resonates with Rudra in some way. I find it interesting to think about. Now, an extra cake is offered for those yet to be born. And this extra cake is buried in a molehill, since the mole is Rudra's sacrificial animal victim. Interesting. By assigning Rudra the insignificant mole as his victim, cows, horses, and other valuable animals are spared potential harm. Sucks for the moles, though. As it does for many nakshatra devatas, the Atharva Veda elaborates on the diseases and injuries attributable to Rudra. Not surprisingly, his illnesses include those associated with extreme natural disasters, such as lightning, hurricanes, and flash floods, as well as life-threatening injuries from poisonous arrows and other sharply pointed weapons. He, Rudra, this is a quote coming from the Atharva Veda. Is that right? Let me just check to make sure. Yeah. So it's the Atharva Veda as unfolded through the Saunika Samhita. So this is really the Atharva Veda, but there's just, I guess, many different ways of moving through the Atharva Veda. And this is a version of it. What we read is, Rudra, whose missile, fever, and cough assails the single victim as the snorting of a stallion who snatches away his victims one by one. To him be reverence. Do not, O Rudra, contaminate us with fever or with poison or with heavenly fire in the form of lightning. Cause this lightning to descend elsewhere than upon us. That comes from the Atharva Veda. It's interesting, this is a time when people lived so much in nature and in natural phenomenon such as lightning and these sorts of things. Now, importantly, this Atharva Veda passage corroborates Rudra's proficiency in curing illnesses caused by poison, whether from serpents, snakes, insects, or arrows. Indeed, poison becomes Rudra's medical specialty. In the later Puranic legend of the churning of the ocean, Rudra, or Shiva, is the only devata capable of consuming the dangerous halahala, the deadly poison emitted by the divine snake Vasuki, without incurring harm. You can read more about that in the episode of Ashlesha. It's the episode of Ashlesha that we are going to discuss, that very important episode where the serpent is spun around the ocean and the devatas have to churn the ocean to obtain the nectar of Amrita, which is given to the gods, while the asuras are distracted. Now, we are on to the next chapter. We're getting through this pretty good here, folks. We got 3 more long pages, and then we're going to discuss the native of this nakshatra aphorism. We've been going for quite a while. It looks like we've been on this for 11, 12, 1, 2. We've been at it for 3 hours. Very interesting. Zuleika has given us a cool comment here. I mentioned the story of the crossroads. It's interesting that Venus is an artistic planet and a passionate planet. The songwriter of the Crossroads, Zuleika tells us, has Venus in Ardra. And I wonder if you mean the original gentleman, Robert Johnson. I wonder if that is who you're talking about, Zuleika. I'd be curious to corroborate that, because that's the guy that I was thinking of, Robert Johnson, as having been the original author, but I could be wrong. But that is a cool thought to bring up in any case. Now, the next thing we're going to be moving towards is the next chapter. The dangerous part of the offering. My light's not gonna, whatever. We're on the next chapter here. The dangerous part of the offering belongs to Rudra. Zuleika mentioned that she was you were talking about Robert Johnson, and this is something we can corroborate as long as Wikipedia has Robert Johnson's birthday correct. I'd say it probably does. So I'm just going to take a moment here, ladies and germs. We're on to our next chapter. We're discussing the dangerous part of the offering. The offering meaning really any sacrifice. So there is a dangerous part that we read about. Teresa's asking about the correct source in birth certificates. I don't know if it's A or AA, but usually if I read an A birth chart, I'll usually roll with that, depending on the website that's giving the source of birth. But it is important to read into where the source of a birthday comes from. Me, myself, I only talk about things that are pretty for sure when it comes to talking about a person's chart. But in any case, that was an excuse for me to eat some chocolate. Now let's go into our next chapter here. We're talking about how the dangerous part of a sacrificial offering belongs to Rudra. It's interesting to think of what that means. You know, there's always a shadow and a light to all things that we move towards. An early legend appearing in the Shatapatha Brahmana explains that Rudra, having been excluded once again from the sacrificial yajna, fails to ascend to heaven. In his typical wrathful fashion, Rudra proclaims, "I have been left behind. They, the gods, are excluding me from the sacrifice." So he went up to heaven after them, and with his raised weapon rose up on the north. Now, to appease Rudra's fury, the gods declare that henceforth his oblation will be the remnants of the sacrificial offerings. Sacrificial remnants include the remainder, the excess oblations, as well as the injured part of the sacrifice. This latter is called the prashitra, considered injured because it was broken off from the main offering. Thus, Rudra receives the epithet vastavya, what is left behind or left over. Interestingly, sacrificial leftovers are referred to as amrita, a term meaning both ambrosia as well as poison. Very interesting. It's interesting to think of, you know, it's like Rudra, like the quote that I'm thinking of that relates to all this. John Lennon has a wonderful quote. He says, "Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans." You're planning for something to happen, and our wills can only have so close of an idea of how we expect things to manifest. Rudra is the aspect of reality that hangs along the side of our wills, because nothing will ever go exactly the way we plan. Rudra is the remnants, the dangerous part of things at the end of things. And it's interesting to sort of read into that and think about that. In truth, the Vishvadevas do not invite Rudra to their yajnas because the catastrophic results of that first cosmic sacrifice are still etched in their divine memory. Let us recall that Rudra pierces Prajapati, after which the gods make an offering of Prajapati's injured part, and that's the Prashitra. Unfortunately, the Prashitra displays perilous properties when offered to even the kindest of devatas, which is Bhaga and Pushan. Bhaga, I believe, loses its teeth, and Pushan loses its eyes. Henceforth, the Prashitra is viewed as particularly dangerous, both by the gods and the officiating priests. That Rudra should be awarded the remainder of the offerings seems punitive. But in reality, this sacrificial protocol speaks to Rudra's ability to accept the most perilous part of the offering without harm. It also emphasizes Rudra's extraordinary capacity for neutralizing or controlling the most dangerous aspects of the sacrifice and life as we know it. Consistent with the theme of sacrificial remnants, Rudra's other offerings include a bali of chaff, which means the discarded part of the grain. Nirti, Mula, is the only other devata allotted chaff, like the chaff of wheat, as a sacrificial oblation. Usually say you want to separate the wheat from the chaff, because the wheat is the good stuff and the chaff is the garbage. So Rudra's offerings include a bali of chaff, which is the discarded part of the grain, as well as the scum of boiled rice. Reflecting his identity with nature, Rudra alone is offered paps made from wild plants, such as priyamgu, which is ponic grass, wild sesame, and gave dukkha, a species of wild corn. During the Sakhameda, a seasonal ceremony performed in the autumn, Rudra's oblations are presented on an arka leaf and hung from a tree away from the sacrificial grounds, rather than served on a potsherd next to the sacrificial hearth. While making oblations to Rudra, the priest touches water to avert the evil effects of the act which is connected with Rudra. Lastly, as with Nirti, with Mula, the nakshatra Mula, offerings to Rudra are made for the express purpose of safeguarding the sacrifice from the destructive malevolence of this god. So it's basically offerings are given to this demonic, uncontrolled, chaotic aspect of reality, and consciousness is afforded to this dimension of reality so that it's not ignored, so that those chaotic elements don't come looking for you. You pay obeisance to it. Rudra's other sacrificial protocols are just as unusual as his birth and unconventional lifestyle. For example, since ash is the remnants of the sacrificial fire, during Prajapati's cosmic yajna, Rudra claims the wild creatures arising from the ashes as his. The ashes, and this is a quote from the Aitareya Brahmana. Just make sure I've got that right. Yeah, this is a quote from the Aitareya Brahmana. The ashes which remained became a being full of links, which went in all directions, and sent forth a stag, buffalo, antelope, camel, ass, and wild beasts. This god, Bhutavat, addressed them, these animals. This is mine. Mine is what was left on the place. That comes from Aitareya Brahmana. Now, during the Pashupata Vrata, an ascetic vow to Rudra as Pashupati, the Yajamana is instructed to bathe in the ashes of the sacrificial fire. And this stuff all has to do with the symbology that we're discussing. Rudra's symbolic association with ash survives into the Puranic period, where Rudra is depicted as a god whose body is covered with ash. So we can see really, everybody knows Shiva covering himself with ash. It's easy to correlate this with, being willing to be in the cremation grounds, to be willing to be dead in the material body. The material body's all dead, but the eternal reality of consciousness lies within. And Shiva wants to remind himself of that. That's the typical understanding that people give correlating Shiva with ash. But that is actually rooted in a deepic Vedic literature lore. Here as Rudra being the part of the classic Vedic yajna ceremony, as the detritus, the excess ash, and, these dimensions of life and reality in this sacrifice that have, this particular nature to them. It's the aspect of the sacrifice that is this dwindling material aspect and reality of it. So this is the real roots of Shiva being covered in ash. It relates to Rudra being such a uncivil, unwanted part of the Vedic ceremony, but them still wanting to give Rudra something. So this is Rudra's association with ash is given in the Puranic period, where he's depicted as being covered with ash, possibly cremation ash, the remnant of a deceased person. In the Brahmanas, Rudra is likened not only to sacrificial ash, but also to sacrificial smoke, which is another remnant of fire. See you later, Teresa. Other nuances include the unusual rites of the Trayambakam, in which one walks counterclockwise around the fire while beating his left thigh. Seemingly, the beating of one's thigh denotes Rudra's alignment with the common working class, the Vaishyas, which is a caste devoted to animal husbandry and agriculture. Interesting. Notice that the inauspicious left side is also identified with Rudra. The left is considered ill-favored, explaining why witchcraft and rites concerning the deceased are performed with the left hand. Most other gods are aligned with the auspicious right side. For example, Pushan carries his goad with his right hand. Indra doles out war booty to devotees with his right hand, and fastens the thunderbolt to his right side for victory, and so on. Very interesting. There's also a note here that says in the Rig Veda, Mandala 10, chapter 90, verse 12, from the thighs of the cosmic Purusha, the Vaishya was born. From his mouth, the Brahmins were born. From his arms, the Kshatriya were born. And from his feet, the Sudras were born. This is, of course, the classic castes. The Sudras are at the feet, the Vaishvas are at the thighs, the Kshatriyas are the arms, and the Brahmins are the mouth. Very interesting. Now, we are now on to our next chapter in our discussion. We're talking about Rudra's howling sons, the Maruts. One of the greatest gifts Rudra bestows upon the universe is his children, the Rudras, Maruts, born together as a troop of brothers. Now this comes from the Rig Veda. As brothers, no one being the eldest or the youngest, these have grown up together to happiness. Young is their clever father, Rudra. Flowing with plenty is Prishni, also known as dappled cow, their mother, who is always kind to the Maruts. Eulogized in the Rig Veda over 500 times and having more than 30 hymns in their dedication, the Rudras certainly, to use an apt phrase, steal their father's thunder. Now we have two long footnotes here. I just want to read through them for a moment. In the Rig Veda, the Maruts are the same as the Rudras. This is evidenced by their identical roles and attributes, mutual parents, Rudra and Prishni, and joint referencing in many hymns. By the time of the Puranas, the Maruts are distinguished as a separate band of 49 atmospheric deities, closely aligned with Indra. Their parents are Kashyapa and Deity. And we can read more of that on the chapter about Indra in Ardra Nakshatra. It's interesting that Indra means the Indriyas. Indra is meditation. Indra represents, in some ways, the developed consciousness that is capable of meditating in a way where you are beyond into the Swaha realm, Swaha Loka, but you are also present with Bhuva, which is the atmosphere. And Indra is the Indriyas, the senses, which is beyond the senses. Indra is the god that exists and transcends the senses, but is fully aware of all the senses in an awake way. That's Indra. The Indriyas are the senses, right? So it's interesting that Indra, as the god of the Indriyas, as the god of the senses, is so close to the Maruts, who exist in Bhuva Loka, which is the atmosphere, the sky, the things permeating reality. It's an aspect of awareness and psychology in the energy field that Indra gets in tune with. Now, we also read in another footnote that Rudra is lauded less than 100 times and has but 4 hymns to his reverence. The number of hymns dedicated to a devata or number of times that's lauded is not necessarily indicative of his importance, but it does suggest the relative significance of that devata to the spiritual practice of the Vedic seeker. Very interesting. Now, the Rudras have many qualities of their father, Rudra, but they do not share his reclusive nature. They are lovingly invited to join in the sacrificial yajnas and are vastly more outgoing and social devatas than their father, even though they are still bhuva loka. They're still atmospheric beings. Rudra in particular is the one that is weird and off. Like Rudra, who is praised as the bright tawny bull of the atmosphere and bejeweled with brilliant golden ornaments, the Rudras are fierce atmospheric forces decked in adornments of glittering gold. They possess serpentine powers, as does their father. The mighty sons of Rudra are the shakers and chasers of the sky, and renowned as rainmakers who yoke the winds as their horses. This energetic, screaming band of devatas is most commonly identified with the phenomenon of lightning. Their swords and shining chariots are crafted of lightning, and they themselves are described as heroes who rejoice in lightning. In one hymn, the Rudras are themselves said to be born of the laughing lightning, perhaps suggestive of their dangerous yet playful nature. Like flashes of lightning, the Rudras are glittering golden powers in the skies. We read in the Rig Veda from several places these following quotes come. The decoration of the Rudras is the same. Their golden chains shine on their arms, their spears sparkle. Holding lightning in their hands, they hasten heavenward, golden helmets on their head. The brilliant Maruts, which is the same as the Rudras, have adorned themselves for beauty. Borne by your golden-footed steeds, O gods, come hither to the sacrifice we offer you. On your shoulders are the spears, on your feet rings kadis. On your chests golden chains, O Maruts. On your chariot gems, fiery lightning in your fists, and golden headbands tied round your heads. And what are these high-class dressers up to? 11 in number, the Rudras roam the atmosphere, where the rain clouds serve as their abode. Ye Rudras who with might 11 live in waters, i.e. the rain clouds. That comes from Mandala 1, chapter 139 of the Rig Veda, early in the Rig Veda. The Rudras bring rain showers that nourish the lands, providing food so that cattle and men may flourish. Prishni is their mother, the milch cow whose udders, the clouds, are milked by the Rudras for the purpose of producing rainfall. Importantly, there are also the war companions of Indra, who, at his beck and call, arrive swiftly to aid in the slaying of the mighty Asuras. It's very important. The whole rain thing, rain is the big deal in so much ancient literature, so much ancient scripture. The rains are often preceded as a spiritual metaphor for the spiritual waters of alignment with the divine impulses coming from inside the spine and inside the soul. The thunder is allotted often. Ernst Wilhelm particularly got me on the idea that lightning represents flashes of information coming from the spine, which is the central tree of life in a lot of ways. And it is the waters of being in tune with the senses as per the direction of the soul. Instead of the water going from outward of the senses coming in, which we will always be thirsty for, if you drink the water from inside the soul, from inside the spine, the true realization of the absolute self, you will never be thirsty again for water, as they say. That's a Christian quote. But of course, that comes from the truth, regardless of the culture that it comes from. The Rudras are revered for protection and safety from rivals. Yet, in their fierce form, they are full of terrible designs like giants, according to the Rig Veda, and likened to wild boars rushing about with iron tusks. They are also depicted as furious beasts and beseeched to turn their heavy hatred on the enemy. True to their name, Rudras, i.e. the howlers or roarers, the wild cries of these shouting maniacs cause forests to bend, the earth to shake, and heaven to tremble. In the Puranas, the Rudras remain true to their Rigvedic characterization as fierce and mighty serpentine asuras of the aerial realm. However, accounts of their Puranic birth are varied. At times, they are deemed the children of Rudra. Elsewhere, they are parented by Kashyapa and wife deity, or Kashyapa and Surabhi, which is cow or earth. That's Surabhi. According to the Vayu Purana, they are the sons of Brahma, as accounted below. You will remember that Shiva, Rudra, had granted Brahma the boon that he would be born as Brahma's son. To ensure that this indeed happened, Brahma began to perform very difficult tapasya. But despite all this meditation, nothing happened. This failure greatly angered Brahma, and he started to cry. As soon as these teardrops fell on the ground, poisonous snakes were born from the tears. This saddened Brahma even more, since unclean creatures had been born as a result of his tapasya. Brahma was so miserable that he fell down unconscious and died. As soon as Brahma died, 11 beings emerged from Brahma's body. They started to cry as soon as they emerged. The word rud means to cry, and these beings came to be known as the Rudras. The Rudras revived Brahma. Brahma realized that Shiva had been born as his son in the form of these 11 Rudras, and then he was happy. That's a Purana. That comes from the Vayu Purana, which is an interesting take on how this stuff all went, right? Very interesting indeed. You know, a lot of these stories are just different depictions of the same thing. In this case, this is the birth of the Rudras. But in any case, that has given us an idea of the Rudras as the sons of Rudra and even the son of Brahma in some way. So, we're not done yet, folks. We have one left. Oh, that was a good stretch. So that has been our depiction of all this stuff from the divine forces of the lunar nakshatras as portrayed in the Vedas. Now we've got one more little bit to go through here, ladies and gentlemen, about the nakshatra of Ardra. And this is going to be combining a little bit of what we've learned of the character of the deity of this nakshatra, which is Rudra. We're going to combine his character with a more down-to-earth, methodical approach to interpreting planets inside the nakshatra of Ardra. Let's see what the author Radhe has to say about planets and important planets, etc., falling into the nakshatra Ardra. I'd like us to keep in mind that this author is a sidereal practitioner. As such, I think that sometimes they'll give examples of things, which I usually try to get past instead of mentioning if I can tell that it's a sidereal example that they're giving, like of actual celebrities and people who have lived. As well, in general, when we're reading through this, I don't consider it as undistorted in potential as what we've read already in Victicara's interpretations. But this author has done so much digging through the Vedas, I think that they often consider the character as relating more to what's given in the Vedas than the sign association. But we have to always be careful to make sure that they aren't blending the sign that this person would understand Ardra to be in. And in this case, they probably imagine it to be in Gemini. We have to make sure that they aren't blending the symbolism of Gemini with Ardra. That being said, they often do a good job with it. Let's move through it and be discerning in what we read here. This is the native of Ardra Nakshatra. Typically, someone with the moon here. But in general, this could also mean anyone with important placements in Ardra Nakshatra. What we read is, one thing is for sure. Just when you think you have this native figured out, you discover new angles in their paradoxical persona. Perhaps the best place to start with this complicated native is at the beginning, their challenging and problematic childhood. Early life complications can include literal or figurative abandonment. Rudra was disclaimed by his Vedic parents, the Vishvadevas. In this person's life, there might be a sense of being unloved or unwanted. There could be a discontent with what is perceived as an inappropriate name or nickname. As we know, it took Prajapati 8 tries to find a name that was grand enough for Rudra. And they might have to work for their parents' attention. Rudra yelled out at birth for the attention of his father. So thus, the native is often faced with the task of rebuilding his confidence and self-image. That does stick, and that's good stuff. That's very Ardra. Now, whether due to insufficient financial resources or inattention to the needs of their offspring, parents of this native may fail to provide nutritious or sufficient food for their child. As we know, the character of Rudra in the Vedas receives only the leftover sacrificial offerings in the Vedic Yajna ceremony. So, an early experience for Rudra natives, especially with the moon in Ardra, I should say Ardra Nakshatra natives. An early experience with male authority figures, particularly one's own father, cultivates in the native a clear preference to fend for themselves at some level. The native learns early on not to rely on others, as others consistently disappoint them, which again is especially not a great placement for the moon, unfortunately. You know, thankfully, in today's time, tropical astrologers would insist that the moon would be in Cancer. And the moon is okay. It's in its own sign in Cancer, at least. So it can learn to be this individual who doesn't need anything. But the moon actually is supposed to be open to the resources and help and love and emotions of those around them. So the moon, that's part of what the moon's job is. It's only an ill moon. Like, look, that's more descriptive of like the moon in Scorpio, which wants to do it all itself. The moon in Taurus identifies its emotions inherently with those who are aligned with its spirit and soul nature. That's Taurus. It's sharing in things in the material world. And that's where the moon is exalted. So the character of this Ardra moon, we could see how it would be difficult to carry on this narrative of someone who doesn't want to rely on others. That's significant. That significates a difficult moon placement. Now, regardless of the particulars, the native's childhood impels them to pursue a different path in life. That this new path is unlikely to be supported or accepted by their parents also suits the native's unconventional nature. In fact, everything about the native is a bit bizarre, for Rudra is unquestionably the misfit amongst the 33 divine forces of the nakshatras. Being fascinated by the untamed forces of the universe, the Ardra Native is drawn to fierce and dangerous aspects of nature, whether thunderstorms and tornadoes, wild animals and snakes, or cemetery grounds and slaughterhouses. A profession involving any of these might be ideal for an Ardra Nakshatra native. Perhaps the native is a storm chaser, a meteorologist, a wildlife biologist, a snake charmer, a mortician, or even a meat butcher. Rudra does, after all, in the Vedic literature, Rudra is known for having pierced Prajapati in Prajapati's form as a stag, as Brahma, who is Prajapati. Rudra pierces the creator who had taken the form of a stag because of that whole story. Again, Rudra was protecting Prajapati's daughter because Prajapati, the creator, wanted to rape its own daughter, its own creation, in order to further creation. But it was this insidious, incestuous thing going on there, which Shiva sought to protect. So being a butcher goes into the character of Ardra in this way. In fact, even a butcher shows the character of Ardra Nakshatra as one who knows that eating meat is going to be done. So an Ardra person can say, well, if this is a fact of life, at least if I'm the one doing it, I know I can give it the proper care that it deserves. And, it's likely that an Ardra person, depending on what planets are in here and what's going on in the chart, the Ardra person might want to be like a halal butcher. Unless they are less awakened and just are feeling their Ardra Nakshatra soul and just want to get into that grimy aspect of life for its own sake, just being attracted to it. This is what the Ardra Nakshatra natives ought to just be aware of, is being subliminally attracted to these dimensions of life, for better and for worse. The Ardra Nakshatra native may be perceived at times to be a risk taker. In reality, they possess a profound understanding of the hidden structures in nature. For example, they might be the expert gambler who rolls the dice only when the stakes involve a high degree of probability. Remember, there is an association of Rudra with gambling halls. Ultimately, what should be portrayed here is that I'm going to say this. I'm going to say the most important thing first, which is that regardless, gambling is an ugly thing to do. And it's not sattvic at all. And most people should take care not to get into gambling. Shiva is not a gambler, but Rudra, in the unevolved form of Shiva, is associated with this kind of thing. And if you find yourself being wrapped up in this sort of thing, I will say, Ardra Nakshatra natives are the types who could have the hardness to do better in that world than others. But it should really only be done, if it's to be done, as some absolutely unavoidable means to an end. And really, gambling itself should never be a means to any end. Even if you win, you're only going to be compelled and addicted to the relief that one gave you, and you're going to do it again, and it's never really worth it. That's just me talking. But I'm not Ardra native, so I'll leave that up to you to figure out. But I don't recommend it. I think this book is more saying be careful with the association of gambling because you could be vulnerable to it. I think that's more of what the book is saying here, in my opinion. The Ardra Nakshatra natives' insight into nature's unseen forces also lends itself to proficiency in mystical fields such as witchcraft, sorcery, alchemy, or shamanism. Very interesting. That completely runs in a line with what I see going on here with Rudra. Now, having an intense personality, this person with Ardra Nakshatra emphasis is perpetually confronted by wrath, whether their own anger and frustration or the anger others inflict upon them. So hence, Ardra is aptly classified in Jyotisha Shastra as a sharp or harsh Tikshna Nakshatra, as we've already seen. And of course, it shares this classification with Mula, with Ashlesha, and with Jyesta Nakshatras. These are the sharp, dreadful Tikshna Nakshatras. As the antithesis of the Pushya native, whose dharma is to preserve the traditions of society, just as Brihaspati, who's the deity of Pushya, ensures the survival of the elite Brahmin caste and its vidya, its purpose, its vision of reality. Ardra being the antithesis of Pushya, the Ardra native lives outside the norms of their culture. They're forever challenging the boundaries of conventionality and orthodoxy. Again, for better and or for worse. Probably both in the case of the life of an Ardra native. Sometimes they're just challenging things that don't need to be challenged, but sometimes they're the only one challenging the things that should be challenged. It's a hard line to draw, especially for the Ardra person. This unconventional, unorthodox nature and behavior may cause this native to turn away from the world, opting for a life of solitude. Their preference is to be surrounded by the beauty of nature and the call of the wild, rather than tall buildings and hordes of human beings. What better venue for contemplating the riddles of life or engaging in austerities than being out in the wild in solitude? Now, relationships are fraught with challenges for this native. They struggle with familial bonds earlier in life. Later, their unconventional lifestyle may alienate their spouse and friends. The Puranic Rudra in the Puranas smears himself with ash, decorates himself with snakes around his neck, styles his hair in dreadlocks, and wears only an animal skin loincloth. His unusual ways and the unusual ways of the native have far-reaching consequences. When Rudra is not accepted by Sati's father, she sacrifices her life for her love for Shiva, for Rudra, which is a whole other cool Puranic story. Although life is not always a picnic for the Ardra Nakshatra native, many gifts and talents are likely to emerge. First, by keeping their goal in sight and applying force, this native attains their aspirations and goals. Rudra is an excellent marksman. They score a bullseye. Rudra scores a bullseye on his first attempt every time, fixing his bow and arrow steady on the target, that being Prajapati's head, while exerting effort. That's how he put his arrow through Prajapati's head. Secondly, Ardra gives an interest in and an aptitude for healing, particularly alternative healing. With a keen awareness of medicinal properties of herbs and plants, this native may especially take to studying botanical medicine. Of course, Rudra is particularly adept at working with poison and other dangerous or unusual substances. This native's field of professional pursuits may expand to areas such as chemotherapy, drug and substance control, or the handling of chemicals and toxic materials. As for general attributes, the Ardra native is youthful, possesses strong limbs, and often sports an unusual hairstyle. There's an attraction for sharp objects, which explains the possible childhood obsession with pocket knives for Ardra natives. Now, something we read here is that Steven Spielberg is said to have Ardra as his lagna, and this comes from astrodatabank.com, or whatever that is. Steven Spielberg is allegedly has Ardra lagna, and he displays several typical Ardra characteristics. Spielberg comments on his sense of being a misfit amongst his friends due to his Orthodox Jewish upbringing. Spielberg often found himself an outcast, the only Jewish kid in school. It was the brunt of anti-Semitic prejudice and victimization in his early life. In his own words, Spielberg comments, "I was embarrassed because we were Orthodox Jews. I was embarrassed by the outward perception of my parents' Jewish practices. I was embarrassed to invite my friends over to the house. I wouldn't know how to explain this to my WASP friends." I don't know what WASP is and what that means or that's in reference to. But Spielberg went on to be one of the most successful film directors, screenwriters, and producers of all time. He achieved tremendous fame for such outlandish films as Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark, all with subject matters befitting unconventional Ardra. They're evidence of his willingness to venture outside the norms of filmmaking. He also produced Schindler's List, a graphic portrayal of the discrimination experienced by Jews during the Holocaust. So therefore, Spielberg's risk-taking nature paid off handsomely in his career. So it's interesting. I would have to look up myself whether Spielberg could be said to have the lagna of Ardra. But I see it, and I get it. And it's interesting, I think what that book was portraying there was an example of how the unorthodox, unconventional nature of Ardra can bring great world-dissolving, pointing the finger at very deep, weird, unconventional things. My friend Zuleika is giving me so much extra information. I appreciate you so much. Zuleika has mentioned WASP is a term that typically means upper-class, snooty, white Christian Protestants. So, obviously, Steven Spielberg, being a Jewish kid with an Orthodox Jewish family, would have felt like an outcast to these WASP friends who were snooty, white-class, upper-class Christian Protestants. Thank you, Zuleika. You've been doing great for me this whole recording. So the outlandish, unconventional character of Spielberg helped him to produce these movies that are very hard, visceral, and very out there and wild, and sometimes difficult, like Schindler's List, which is about the Jewish people in the Holocaust being disseminated in the way that the hard Nazis were dealing with the Jewish people. Like, that's like looking into the crematorium. That's like sitting with the human skull. You know, that's very Shiva and Ardra. And it did well for Steven Spielberg, only having his Lagna there. So this is a pretty good portrayal of the character, of this unconventionality that can bring so much goodness, hardness, realness through the Ardra Nakshatra native's life, character, and behavior, and destiny. So that was our reading coming from the divine forces of the lunar nakshatras as portrayed in the Vedas by Radhe. Very interesting, very deep, very good way of seeing this nakshatra in a experienced personified light. I appreciate you as well, Zuleika. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a long podcast, as it so often does. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this has been How to Rock Astrology. It's been nice going through the character of Ardra and Shiva, and Rudra as Shiva, to see a little bit into the psyche and the Vedic literary roots of the character of Shiva. Stay tuned for more, folks. Probably next week, I'm going to be discussing more of this stuff. The next nakshatra in our series is going to be Punarvasu. And that'll be the next thing that we go into. As well, I've still got my Lagnas coming out, and I'm going to be doing more sextrology stuff as time goes along as well. So we still got lots to go through, ladies and gentlemen. For now, everybody who's been hanging out with me today, I really appreciate it. It's been very nice seeing you and chatting with you all. My name is Dustin Cormier again, and I will see you guys on the next episode on the other side. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. Let me know in the comments what you think, what you thought. I'll always try to stay in touch. I'll see you guys around. Thanks so much for spending time with me.